Okay, colleagues, if I could ask you to take your seats, and we'll ask our media friends to turn the cameras off, please. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in. I apologize. We did have a vote that was unexpected this morning, so we apologize for beginning late. This is the 10th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance of this session, and our orders today, pursuant to Standing Order 83.1, this is the start of our pre-budget consultations 2011 for next year's budget. We want to thank all of you for coming in this morning. We have with us here this morning, we have Mr. Marc Lavoie, Professor titulaire, Département des Sciences économiques.
Marc Lavoie, full professor, Department of Economics, University of Ottawa.
Porter, Deputy Chief Economist. We have from the Canadian Labour Congress, Monsieur Sylvain Chétain, Économiste Principal. From the Conference Board of Canada, we have Mr. Glenn Hodgson, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist. And from Laurentian Bank Securities, we have Mr. Carlos Lataille, Économiste en Chef. Bienvenue. Thank you all for coming in. We will have about 5 minutes from each of you for an opening statement, and then we'll have questions from members. Et on va commencer avec Monsieur Lavoie, s'il vous plaît.
We'll begin with Mr. Lavoie, please. Good morning. Thank you. First of all, I should point out that I'm not a forecaster. What I'm going to be telling you is based on my experience, on my feelings, and on my understanding of microeconomics. To get in a nutshell, I would say that there is no doubt that we are heading straight for a second recession, or at least we're going towards a period of zero growth. In my opinion, we're going to witness what I would refer to as a Nipponization of the Western economy, meaning that we'll have zero growth, if not negative growth, for several years. For the past few months, we have seen that all of the large institutions are revising their forecasts downward. The Department of Finance, according to the consensus of economies and the budget presented in March, and announced a growth rate of 3% and for next year in Canada and the United States. And when we read the last forecast, we've gone from 3% to 2% for Canada and from 3% to 1.5% for the United States. But what we do know is that the forecasters, when the economy is spiraling downward, the forecasters generally are often too optimistic. Just to give you an example, as you know, when we saw the fall of the Lehman Brothers on September 15th, 2008, well, on October 13th, 2008, the general consensus was, or that as of October 13th, that Canada was going to continue to have a growth rate of 1.1% for 2008-2009. But in reality, what happened was that in 2009, we had a negative growth. And for the United States, the consensual forecast for 2009 was a growth rate of 0%. And in fact, the growth rate for the United States for 2009 was minus 3.4%. For the past few months, we have been going through a period of uncertainty, which is very similar to what I experienced back in 2008. That is, every week there seems to be 4 or 5 pieces of news that come out that the news is frankly stupefying or worrisome. In the United States, the economy, the recovery is not really taking place. The budgetary consolidation plan that the government in the United States is grappling with is not going to help, and the new recovery plan under President Obama has a little chance of being implemented. What's even more worrisome is the situation in Europe. Everyone's been talking about it lately. There is a lot of talk about the sovereign debt crisis. In May of 2010, the European Central Bank intervened, purchasing government securities. This was the first time this had been done. A European Stabilization Fund was created, but it's already clear that this was too little too late. So the European crisis seems to be irreversible, particularly since the politicians feel that they would be better off focusing on budget austerity. And we could see what happened in Ireland and the United Kingdom. You can see that the austerity measures did not have the results they were hoping to get. There are problems with the structural recovery of the Eurozone. The Eurozone has structural flaws. It was created that there would never be such a crisis, and now we know that the financial markets are not always right, and so they're dealing with a crisis. To conclude, I would say that Canada will not be able to magically escape this economic crisis. When the crisis takes place in Europe, well, there will be an earthquake in Europe, and we're going to be hit by a tsunami. That's going to affect all of North America, including the United States and Canada, of course. And given our trade with the United States, we are going to suffer as a result. So I would say that the Canadian government must not introduce these spending cuts, and secondly, it can't go ahead with the spending cuts, and thirdly, it's going to have to implement a new recovery plan for infrastructure and abandon its return to budgetary balance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the members for inviting me here today. There's no doubt the world economy has been faced with numerous challenges since the start of 2011. It started this year with the crisis or the unrest in the Middle East, which led to a spike in energy prices. Of course, that was followed by Japan's trio of disasters, which created supply chain problems globally. Then in the summer, we were faced with the U.S. debt limit debate, which sparked turmoil in financial markets more generally. And rumbling beneath all of these challenges has been the ongoing European debt crisis, which is probably now the single biggest risk to the global economic outlook. And all of these factors have, in each one of their own ways, conspired to no doubt darken the economic outlook, because through one channel or another they have hit either consumer, business, or investor confidence. Now, while we continue to believe that Canada and the U.S. will manage to claw out some growth over the next year, it looks to be very modest at best. We've recently revised our GDP forecast down to 1.5% to 2% for both Canada and the U.S. in 2012. That's not significantly different from the problem-plagued, underwhelming environment we've seen in 2011, and it is down about a percentage point from where we would have seen both Canada and the U.S. as recently as 4 months ago. And given such subdued growth, I would say that it would really only take one more negative shock to basically tip the economy over into an outright downturn, such as a serious policy error in one of the major economies, or something akin to the Lehman Brothers shock that we suffered back in the fall of 2008. Now, for Canada specifically, we have consistently outperformed the U.S. and most of our global counterparts for the last 5 years. On average, the Canadian economy has grown by about 0.5% faster than the U.S. economy, but I would stress that that really is only a difference of degree and not direction. And the reality is that if the U.S. and the broader global economy got into significant difficulties, then Canada would unfortunately only be a step behind or so. Even from Europe, there are a number of different channels through which a problem in the European economy can be transmitted to the Canadian economy. There's the direct export channel. Admittingly, Europe is not a huge destination for our exports, but they do still absorb about 8% of our total exports, which is by itself is significant. There's also the financial market channel, much as we've seen in recent weeks. Global equity markets are more interlinked than ever before, so whenever we suffer serious downdrafts even in European equities, that can directly affect Canadian equities that very day. There are the financial linkages through the banking sector. If European banks get into serious difficulties, that can affect the North American economy. And finally, there's the indirect effect of commodity prices, and we've certainly seen that in recent weeks. Concerns over the global economy can translate into much weaker commodity prices, and we've seen that quite clearly in recent weeks, where we've had a huge step back in commodity prices. And of course, as a significant commodity producer and export, a significant drop in commodity prices at this time too can affect the Canadian economy. So in other words, even if we do everything right, even if we get every policy right, we can still be obviously quite clearly affected by a problem in the global economy. As well, the Canadian dollar is vulnerable to a pullback in commodity prices, as we have seen in recent weeks. For policymakers, I'd suggest that in this kind of environment, caution really is the watchword. Certainly from the monetary policy front, we have seen the Bank of Canada on hold for the last year. Our view is that the Bank of Canada is likely to keep interest rates unchanged right through to the end of 2012. They will remain quite cautious in this kind of environment. For fiscal policy, I think the important thing at this point is to be flexible. I don't think that things have deteriorated to the point yet where we need a change of tack at this point, but I think that policymakers have to be cautious in this kind of environment where there are quite serious tail risks. I mean, right before our eyes, we see, the risks playing out in financial markets. It's almost as if we're having a day-by-day debate in financial markets whether we're headed for another global recession or whether the global economy will continue to churn out modest growth or not. And I think in that extremely uncertain environment, fiscal policy basically has to remain flexible. That's my main message. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Porter. Ensuite, Monsieur Champagne, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Au nom des 3,2 millions de...
Thank you. On behalf of the 3.2 million members of the Canadian Labour Congress, we would like to thank you for affording us the opportunity to present our views on the Canadian and world economy. We've been hearing economists, banks, the OECD. These institutions are all more and more concerned about economic perspectives, including Canada. In the United States, Europe, and Canada, we could slip into a technical recession soon. And even if this was avoided, we're almost certainly in for a long period of very sluggish growth and continued high unemployment. Why? We've talked about many issues. I would like to go now into 5 different issues that are at the source of the problems. First of all of these investments made by the government, these investments have led to a recovery in 2009, but they've at least lessened the harsher impacts of the recession. But unfortunately, this is coming to a close, or the stimulus package in Canada has already come to an end. And what we're seeing is that we're seeing a transfer to austerity policies and to maintain public investments. Secondly, we also see at the international level, we have seen that there's been a difficulty with reforming the financial system. This has been put off by the G20. We have tried to reform the system in order to prevent these problems from occurring, but in an absence of a reform, we have more and more hedge funds. The third element, which is very important for us, is the whole issue of house debt, which is very high. And the housing prices have collapsed in the United States, in England, and in some other countries, which means that today household spending is very, very weak, and the governments are cutting back. So the governments are now are focusing more on austerity programs. The fourth problem that we have noticed is more fundamental. It's a problem we don't deal with. It's about establishing trade surpluses. We have some countries have large trade surpluses. Here I refer to China, but also Germany. And it's allowing wages to rise and to import more from countries with high unemployment rates. And this is very difficult for those countries that have large unemployment rates. So we can see in many countries there is a lack of growth, particularly in the United States, Canada, part of Europe as well. They're having a lot of trouble recovering, and therefore the manufacturing sectors have been hard hit. There are also root problems as a result of various crises. There was the problem before 2008 where we were dependent on the growth of household debt and speculative bubbles as opposed to real investment, and that's created a lot of problems. The growth which occurred before 2008, it was dependent on household debt growing and speculative bubbles as opposed to real investment in a balanced economy, an economy which enables us to create sustainable shared prosperity through real investment and rising productivity linked to rising wages. So there are 5 major issues, and they're both short-term and long-term problems that we need to deal with. In Canada, it's very clear that the economic growth here has been very slow this year. This year in the first quarter it was positive, but this was linked to a buildup of inventories. But the third quarter is expected to be negative. We find ourselves in a situation where we've actually recovered to pre-recession levels, but the unemployment rate was 7.3%, well above the 6% registered before the Great Recession. Youth unemployment is very, very high, higher than what it was before the recession. Youth unemployment is 14%, and the real unemployment rate, which counts those workers who have given up for looking for jobs and involuntary part-time workers, is about 11%. When you look at the labor market, we can see that there has been no real job recovery. The real salaries have started going down. When you look at the labor force survey, which was held in August, we can see that the average hourly rate went up by just 1.4%, but the inflation rate was much higher, 2.7% in July, 1.1% in June, and 3.7% in May. So real wages continue to fall due to a very weak economy, and it will further undermine a weak recovery, negatively impacting upon consumer spending and perhaps serving as a tipping point to a major fall in the Canadian economy. I could continue discussing the labor market situation, but I would like to look at what we could do. We find ourselves in the following situation. In order to continue growing, there are 3 solutions. We increase exports, decrease imports, or companies invest more, or the third element would be public investment. We know that in Canada, the investments in company is linked to exporting, and now that our clients are no longer buying our products, these companies will no longer want to invest so much. So public investments remain our last recourse. It is important. The borrowing costs are very low. We have the means, therefore, and it doesn't cost very much to borrow, to really focus on public investment. We have to continue with the infrastructure program, social infrastructure for child care, and help older people. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I basically have 3 points to make as opening remarks. First of all, on the global context, We're in the midst of a crisis of confidence right now, which is really a function of an inadequate policy response to what's happening in Europe and arguably to the fiscal position and the recovery in the United States as well. I won't go into great depth on that, but I think it really points to the need to build confidence as the critical purpose of the committee meeting today and indeed of the whole design of Canadian economic policy going forward. This should all about being restoring confidence in Canadians as consumers, as investors, as people actually believe we have a strong economic future. I could go into great depth on what the solution is in Europe, for example, but I won't do that. I did spend the first 10 years of my career at the Department of Finance and another 3.5 years at the IMF, so I've actually lived through this. I feel like I'm watching a bad movie second time around, and it's very tragic, but there are solutions. It's not a hopeless circumstance, but it's also going to be very painful, in particular for taxpayers in a country like Greece, which is nowhere near the bottom in terms of its adjustment. So confidence is the critical anchor. Secondly, on our economic outlook, we were actually one of the weakest forecasters in the pre-budget round of forecasts. We came up with a forecast in the first quarter of this year of growth of 2% this year, a little bit stronger in 2012. I know we're at the lower end of the range, and unfortunately, we think the future is turning out that way. So we revise our forecast each quarter, and we just finished the revisions for Q3, and we're now forecasting growth in Canada this year of 2.1% and about 2.5% for next year. The trouble is that forecast is not symmetrical in that I don't think the array of risks around it are even. I think there's a lot more risk of things happening on the downside, bad things happening, than having upside potential. And that means you have to really build a note of caution into the fiscal forecast going forward, because I think growth is really being hampered right now. Nominal growth in our economy is below the track that we were on. We thought we were on 9 months ago. Exports, for example, are probably about $30 to $40 billion below what they could be if our economy was performing at potential. And, of course, nominal growth is the key driver for government revenues. And, therefore, we shouldn't be at all surprised if government revenues are a little bit below the path that Mr. Flaherty set out in his budget because of slower nominal income growth. And that brings me to the third and final point, which is on the design of fiscal policy right now. These are exceptional circumstances. We should have rebuilding confidence as the anchor point. That's the key objective of the budget going forward. And for me, that means being prepared to make course corrections along the way, being very pragmatic, building prudence into the outlook, and not being wedded to one view, because the circumstances clearly have changed outside our borders, and we have to find ways to adapt to that. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily more stimulus, because, in fact, we don't have enough data right now to really reach a conclusion on whether the economy has slowed down, nor does it mean stepping on the brake. So I think, for example, with slower nominal income growth, if we have to move the target to balance the budget out by a year or two, very common sense adaptation, I think we should be prepared to make that adjustment. If the economy needs more stimulus at some point, we should be open-minded to that. But certainly that's not the Conference Board's view right now, that we have to add anything exceptional. So it's not just a matter of staying the course. It's being prepared to make common sense course corrections along the way, depending upon the needs of the economy. Mr. Chairman, I'll make two more points. I had a commentary that was run in, I think, about half the newspapers in the country about a month ago on tax expenditures. And as the federal government thinks about reviewing overall government spending, let's not forget the fact that tax expenditures represent about a $100 billion revenue sacrifice for the federal government. We have 190 separate exemptions now within our personal income tax system. So let's at least be open-minded to considering tax expenditures as part of any overall review of spending, because there could be interesting sources of revenue there that would preclude the need to have quite as much spending contraction on the spending side. And the other point I would make, and here I'll echo what other speakers have said, infrastructure is the best form of adding stimulus to our economy. We did a series of studies for various governments across the country during the recovery period. And if there was a desire to add a little bit more horsepower within the structure, even within the current level of spending, shifting spending towards infrastructure spending would both provide stimulus for the economy and address a real need. And any of you who've crossed the Champlain Bridge in Montreal know exactly what I mean in terms of the crying need for investment in infrastructure in this country. But I'll stop right there, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Hodgson. Monsieur Letel, s'il vous plaît.
All right. Once again, thank you for inviting me to appear before this committee. I'm the pleasure of being the last one, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of what was said. Basically, I agree generally with the fact that the global economy has indeed slowed a lot. Economic growth is now much weaker, both in the United States, in Europe, and globally, than we thought only 2-3 months ago. And we have to adapt to that. A recession in 2012 is possible. It's not part of our forecast. We still think that it can be avoided, but certainly one needs to realize that it is indeed a possibility. However, unlike 2008, where it really did hit us hard and almost unexpectedly, this time around we can see it coming. And the reason I think that it is not inevitable to have a recession is that policymakers in the United States and in Europe know very well what needs to be done to avoid such an outcome. Now, democracy is messy, as you all know. It's not always, it's not always possible to do what needs to be done right away. But I wouldn't dismiss the capability of the European, governance mechanisms to address the situation. It will take time. They will probably push it to the last possible second, but I think they will be able to avoid a major, messy default of Greece, for example. So it is very serious. It is very risky, but I am not ready to assume that it is necessarily going to collapse. Now, Canada. Of course, as was said before, this time around, if there is a recession outside our borders, we are not going to escape. That's obvious. I'll go even one step further. Last time around, 2008-09, we did escape most of the impact of the recession for two basic reasons. One, monetary policy. Interest rates came down very quickly. And secondly, there were fiscal plans put in motion by the federal government and the provinces to address those issues. This time around, we won't be able to do the same things. Interest rates are already at very low levels. I don't think they can go any lower than this. I don't think the Bank of Canada would cut the overnight rate. I don't think it will serve any purpose. Market rates are very low. 10-year yields are at actually at 2% now or thereabouts. So it is very low, historically speaking. So that we've done that. On the consumer coming to the rescue, as they did in 2008 and 2009 by massively borrowing, getting mortgages and whatnot. Again, given the high levels of household debt at this point, I think that's a place we should not go. We should not try and push that elastic anymore. So that leaves us with exports and business investment. Private business investment, there are perhaps ways that governments can think of to stimulate and to favor private business investment. Public investment is also welcome at this point, and I think we should, as a government, should be prepared to perhaps accelerate some projects. However, I wouldn't, also put the great deal of emphasis on that. I mean, those projects, you mentioned, Glenn, the Champlain Bridge. It's something that needs to be done. And so if we decide to rebuild the bridge, it's because we need to rebuild the bridge, not because we need to stimulate the economy. And that's a big project. It's, I don't know, $1.5 billion, something like that. But it wouldn't do much for GDP growth in the first quarter of 2012. But it needs to be done. And interest rates are very low. And so that will be a good time to do something like that. But finally, when it comes to fiscal policy, when we think of the upcoming budget, to be flexible, because we're not quite sure what's coming down the line, to be able to think in terms of rebuilding confidence, stabilizing consumer confidence, and improving business confidence. Those are, to me, the keys. And there are perhaps measures that can be done very quickly that can put money in people's pockets if we need to boost confidence. Incomes are low indeed, wages are weak, so we should think of measures like that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. We'll start members' questions with Ms. Nash, and I'll just remind our witnesses and our colleagues very short time for questions and answers, so we'll ask both to be brief, please. We'll start with Ms. Nash, please.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists for being here today. Very, very interesting presentations, and we certainly appreciate your experience and your expertise. I hear you all citing similarities in terms of identifying the problems. I hear some difference in terms of Mr. Chataigne, Monsieur Lavoie saying that they feel it's probably very likely we're going to be into recession. Others of you are saying it's unclear to remain. We should remain flexible. We have had significant debate in the House and in this committee about the value of austerity at this point in time, which has been the government's approach, versus the value of investing in the economy through infrastructure investments. Each of you has mentioned this in some way. And I guess my question is, could we be further damaging our economy by pursuing a path of austerity at this point, which we are, in terms of taking out $4 billion a year and cutting services? And should we instead be investing in building needed infrastructure now rather than waiting for a further crisis to hit? Should we not be preventing problems down the road? And let me begin, Monsieur Lavoie, avec vous, si vous voulez commenter.
You wish to comment, Mr. Lavoie? When a government pursues policies that lead to a deficit on a microeconomic basis, the effect is immediately positive. That's the advantage of our economy. If the government spends more money on the economy, it's as if the consumers or the businesses would in turn spend more money on the economy as well. The only reason why there should be a reversal of the austerity policy would be for psychological reasons. Some of my colleagues talked about confidence. If the consumers and business feel that a higher deficit would have a negative impact on the economy, well, this type of speculative thinking may in fact be self-fulfilling. But from a purely economic point of view, if we don't have that psychological issue, it's clear that this is the only way to get out of the crisis. Consumption can't really increase because Canadian households are already indebted. Business investment in Canada is at a stalemate. Nothing's happening. Our exports are therefore going to fall off, and we won't be able to export to Europe or the United States. So I think that public spending is what we need.
Monsieur Chataigne.
Oui, je suis d'accord avec l'analyse.
Yes, I agree with this analysis. I'd go even further. First of all, look at the government's situation and its desire to balance its books. What caused this? There was a problem with the income tax rates, as the government was deprived of revenue. Now, this income that we're no longer getting, what can we do? What decisions do we have to make? There are two choices. Give more money to companies that are profitable, or companies, we know that companies aren't investing right now, and what's the result of that? Or else we could take this money and invest in infrastructure, which creates jobs. We have calculations that show that $500 million invested in infrastructure creates 12,000 jobs. But if you invest in the infrastructure program, it creates 17,000 jobs. So as a society, what do we want to do? Create jobs in the country in order to restore the consumer confidence? And the best solution for us is clear. With this situation, we mustn't cut back. We have to invest more and create more jobs in the country. Thank you.
And then Mr. Hodgson.
We've got about 10 seconds, Mr. Hodgson.
Mr. Chairman, I think we're kind of driving down the road right now. We should avoid putting a foot on the gas or a foot on the brake. We have to gather more information. It would be inappropriate to take stimulus out of the more stimulus out of the economy through fiscal contraction, but I don't think this is the time to be adding exceptional fiscal stimulus either. You can always move money around within a $250 billion federal budget.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Nash, we'll go to Mr. Adler, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank all of the witnesses for their appearance here this morning. But my question is to Mr. Porter. In light of the fact, even going back to May the 2nd, where the #1 issue during the federal election was the economy, and to maintain a prudent course, and the people chose to elect a strong, stable, national, conservative majority government where the economy was the #1 issue. And the fact that Canada has been recognized as the strongest economy in the G7 by a number of international economic organizations, from the IMF to the World Economic Forum to the Economic Intelligence Unit. From your vantage point, in light of all of those factors, how would you assess the economic leadership of the Prime Minister and our Finance Minister?
I would say compared to policymaking in the rest of the world, Canada's economic policymaking has been exemplary. I don't think there's been a significant misstep in recent years. I guess the one comment I would make, and this goes back somewhat to the previous question, when we look at the message the financial markets are sending us right now, though, I think the main focus of the markets is a concern over the weakness of growth. It's not a particular focus on the U.S. budget deficit or the Canadian budget deficit. It's not a concern about inflation. It is a concern about the weakness in growth that is potentially facing us in the global economy. I mean, anytime you have long-term government borrowing costs of about 2% in both Canada, the U.S., as well as Germany and the U.K., in an environment where inflation is close to 2%, that's suggesting the bond market sees very little growth in the years ahead. And I do think that is really the overriding challenge for policymakers globally at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Minutes, 2.5 minutes.
Carry on?
Yeah.
Okay. So in light of your remarks, clearly there are a number of dangers that are lapping at our shores, and that are. Would you agree there that in light of that the Canadian policymakers have left enough flexibility in their toolbox to deal with any impending possibilities, contingencies that could occur?
I think there certainly is more flexibility in Canada at this point than almost any other major industrialized economies. On the monetary policy front, there are still things that can be done. Of course, interest rates can be cut. I think there's a very high barrier before we'll actually see the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates. But there is some room to go there, and there even when we get interest rates down to zero, the Bank of Canada has talked about this before. There are still options. There are things that the Bank of Canada can do. Yeah. On the fiscal front, well, I would agree wholeheartedly with Glenn's comments. I don't think there's any need for change at this point. But our AAA credit rating is not in question. There is still some room in a very bad case for the global economy, where there is some room for Canadian policymakers to move on that front. And finally, I think the reality is that in any kind of a global downturn, we are going to see the Canadian dollar weaken, which will lend some support to our manufacturing sector and our tourism sector. Now, that's not something that we can control directly, but I think that would be a natural byproduct of a downdraft in the global economy if it comes to that.
Thank you.
So the short answer is I do think there is some flexibility here, which which is not the case in many other major economies.
Right. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. We'll go to Mr. Bryson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to each of you for appearing before us during these troubled times. One of the things that has helped Canada get through the last downturn was fairly consistent demand for commodities, and that helped us, during that period and since then and during the recovery. With China having just reported a third month of contraction in the manufacturing sector, is there some fear that China will not be able to aid in Canada's recovery or separation from our trading partners in terms of their trends versus ours at this time?
We don't do a formal forecast of China, but we look at the consensus forecast, and the view of other forecasters around the world is that China will still be able to grow at about 8% this year, plus or minus maybe a half a percentage point. Absolutely true that manufacturing has pulled back the last few quarters by virtue of the weakened demand globally. And China's biggest challenge right now is shifting from almost over-reliance upon external sources of demand, meaning exports, and learning how to grow a stronger consumption base within the country. And there's risk factors every place. So you could look at the housing bubbles in Shanghai, for example. You look at the fact that the Chinese have an underdeveloped financial system and are still developing instruments. But for the most part, most forecasters believe China will still be able to sustain growth, not double digits any longer, but something like 8%. And for me, that means chronically strong pressure on commodity prices because we have a whole new source of global demand now added through China. So risky, absolutely, and China is going to have to go through transformation internally, but we still build it into our thinking as a positive force on commodity prices.
You've said that the government must not implement spending cuts at this time. Mr. Porter, you said caution is the watchword, and that there shouldn't be a change now in terms of cutting government spending at this time. Monsieur Chétin, you've said that, again, now is the wrong time to cut. Mr. Hodgson, you said don't put on the brakes several times and said no fiscal contraction. And Mr. Leto, you've said the same thing. Further, the chief economist and your colleague Sherry Cooper at the Bank of Montreal, Nesbitt Burns, has said that it has described it as the misplaced belief that the road to economic prosperity is paved by near-term fiscal tightening, as espoused by Prime Minister Harper, shows that we've learned nothing from Herbert Hoover's response to the Great Depression. Is it safe to say that all of you believe that now is not the time to cut government spending in Canada?
Maybe start with that. Certainly. However, when we talk about fiscal austerity and we see what is going on in Greece, in Portugal, in the UK, in the US possibly, I mean, the kind of fiscal austerity that is coming down the pipeline in Canada is fairly mild compared to that. We will still have a deficit next year in this country, a modest deficit. Mm-hmm. There are some realignments in how the government is spending money, but overall, Canadian fiscal policy is still, is not as austere, not as restrictive as that in other countries. And what some of my colleagues have pointed out is that, we still have flexibility that if need be, early in 2012, to reverse some of that, then we could do that. But I wouldn't put Canadian austerity in the same league as Greek austerity.
Let me just, you're being, you'd make a good politician in some ways. Is now the time to reduce government spending in Canada, given that we're seeing potentially contagion throughout the European bank sector? We're seeing sovereign debt crisis in Europe, political and fiscal incapacity to deal with the situation in the U.S. Is now the time to reduce government spending in Canada right now? Change course.
Just a brief response, please.
Change course? No. To have massive spending cuts? No.
I would say that the prudent policy now would be to increase government expenditures and forget about sound finance and move forward with an expansionary fiscal policy. It would be prudent given all these negative signs around us.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Unfortunately, his time is up. We'll have to move on to another round. Go to Mr. Hoback, please.
Well, again, thank you, Chair, and again, thank you all for coming out here this afternoon. I apologize for the lateness with the vote and that, but still, it's great to hear your comments on the economy and what Canada should be doing. You know, I come from Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan unemployment rate's around 4%. Our economy is booming. If you talk about recession or possible recession, people look at you kind of cross-eyed. So it's hard for me in a lot of ways to talk about spending or not spending. And especially when we're looking at a budget that's going to come out in February, March of this next year, you know, I guess what I'm trying to do is find out some facts of things that we can actually say, okay, what's concrete at this point in time that we can take forward. You've all basically talked about, I won't say all, but most of you talked about being flexible, cautious but flexible. So basically it sounds to me like there's endorsement on what we're doing right now. It's just be ready or be flexible in case we see things get worse. And we don't have crystal balls, so I think the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have always talked about, you know, there's always flexibility in something moving forward. But, you know, there's things that we can do as a government regardless to make us more competitive, to increase our productivity. And I think the one area I guess I'd like your comment on is what kind of barriers or regulations could we remove that should be removed anyways? I know, Mr. Hodgson, you talked about a bridge, I believe, in Montreal, the Champlain Bridge, that it should be replaced not because of stimulus, but because it needs to be replaced. So is there items in government right now that should be replaced just because they need to be replaced, whether it's regulatory, whether it's looking at programs that no longer meet the demand or are no longer relevant? Have you identified any of those things, whether it be regulatory burdens or stuff like that we should look at? And maybe, Mr. Hodgson, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much. We actually wrote a brief about 3 weeks after the election to give free advice to a new majority government. And it was a fairly comprehensive brief. So we covered macro policy, which we're talking about today, fiscal policy in the form of that, but also some of the micro adjustments required, because our research program at the Conference Board is fully aligned around boosting Canada's growth potential, raising productivity, raising prosperity for the country. And it's a fairly long list. It's things like expanding our horizon when it comes to free trade and entering free trade negotiations with other parts of the world. We've made great progress in Latin America. We're talking now to India, to the European Union. I'd like to see us be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example. Unfortunately, we have this thing called supply management, which precludes us from sitting at the table. So there's a kind of barrier that's actually preventing Canada from seizing its full potential when it comes to free trade. We believe that we're severely underinvested as a country in infrastructure. And we haven't done the numbers, but others have, engineers have, the Federation of Municipalities has, and I think their number going back 5 years was a deficit of about $130 billion in terms of infrastructure investment. So that tells me there's huge scope for realigning government spending priorities and making sure we're making adequate investments in roads, in ports, in bridges, to ensure that the Montreal economy works well. Can you imagine if the Champlain Bridge actually broke and you could not have commerce between the South Shore and downtown Montreal? That would be a huge loss to Montreal's GDP and to Canada's GDP. So things like that, reform is possible on many, many fronts. Maybe I can share the brief with you and we can have a discussion about that in detail. It's on our website, by the way, but I will share it with perhaps with the clerk to share with the committee.
It's interesting because you talk about the bridge in Montreal. I have a bridge in my riding in Prince Albert that's in a similar shape where we only got 2 lanes of traffic where we normally have 4 lanes. So again, there's things that have to replace just because it's time to replace or need to be fixed because they need to be fixed. That's not necessarily a stimulus package. It's just reality of running a day-to-day operation of a good government. I guess what I'm kind of looking forward is the regulatory side of things. For example, the securities officer, having that consistent across Canada. You know, there's some things like that. Would you have any comment on that, Mr. Hodgson?
Certainly, we're on the record and have been for some time now that there should be a single national securities regulator, not popular in at least 2 provinces. That's not welcomed in Quebec. That's not welcomed in Alberta. And that's why our finance ministers keep talking about sort of a plan B, the passport system, things that would look like a national regulatory body. We're on the record, though, talking about the need to eliminate barriers in many forms between provinces and have much closer alignment between the federal government and the provinces when it comes to a whole variety of regulations. I could point to something like environmental regulation, for example, where we have actually processes that often run federally and provincially on the same project, when clearly the right outcome is to have a Canadian standard and one process that's much more efficient and yet protects the environment just the same.
Okay. Would you probably say the same thing about skills assessments? So a plumber in Quebec would be recognized as a plumber in Saskatchewan, and
Okay, very briefly.
Absolutely, and workers who live in Quebec should be able to repair roofs in Ontario. And there have been discussions between provincial governments on that. But the more we can do to bring alignment between federal and provincial practice and across the country amongst provinces, the better, because that's a natural way to boost productivity.
Thank you. Thank you. Go to Monsieur Maé, s'il vous plaît.
D'abord, merci d'être ici.
First of all, thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Mr. Lactau and Mr. Hodgin for having addressed the issue of Champlain Bridge. That's in my writing, and I'm working very hard to get the government to invest in this bridge. We know that this would enable the Montreal economy to grow. We're talking about a loss of $3 billion because of the traffic losses. In your opinion, and my question is for all witnesses who are experts in the economy, is there an economic reason why we should not invest in the bridge right now? I don't see why we wouldn't delay investing in this bridge. But once again, I think it's important to make this investment, but not in an effort to stimulate the economy. It's because it has to be done. This bridge is very important for the local economy. Yes, it also creates jobs. Now, as far as where we are in terms of the Canadian economy, the government continues to say that the action plan, which was undertaken a couple years ago, is still valid and that it doesn't need to continue. Without parling about stimulus per se, I would go back to what Mr. Porter said. There was a Montreal Gazette article yesterday. It said that
Air, that's certainly the wrong prescription. Is that your words?
I missed part of the, sorry.
Just basically saying that the government should be aggressively cutting spending when the economy is gasping for air. That's the wrong prescription. Basically, that's the article where Sherry Cooper, your chief economist, said that economic policies advocated by Prime Minister Stephen Harper and others in response to the European debt crisis could lead to another global recession and financial crisis. So basically, my question is, do you believe it's time now for the government to roll out a new plan that would at least set out what the objectives and maybe the priorities, if we're talking about infrastructure? Do you think we should do that now?
As I indicated in my earlier comments, I think it's early to change tack. Now, having said that, we could have a rather dramatic change in the economy in the months ahead. I do believe the U.S. economy is in danger of a renewed downturn. The one thing I would say is that a lot of the most recent data we've seen, the most pronounced weakness we've seen are in things like sentiment and confidence in the financial markets. In terms of what people are actually doing and buying and producing in the U.S. has not meaningfully cracked yet. So the U.S. economy still looks like it's growing slowly, no question about it, but it doesn't look like it's actually tipped into an outright downturn yet when you look at the absolute spending and production numbers, and similar story here in Canada. So I think I still do believe it's too early to change tack. My comment in terms of the aggressive spending cuts, I don't believe that we're seriously considering aggressive spending cuts in Canada. That was really aimed more at the U.S. economy, where some are advocating the answer to their woes is a major contraction in the fiscal situation. I just don't believe that's the right answer in the U.S. at this point.
Thank you. Peut-être une question dirigée justement.
I have a question for Mr. Chatang. The government wants to decrease corporate taxation by saying that this creates jobs. You dealt with this issue somewhat. Could you please repeat what impact such a tax reduction would have on job creation? Is corporate tax reduction the path that we should be taking? The answer to your question is no. That's not the right path, because tax reductions will apply to profitable companies. And these companies, when they pay less taxes, they make even more profits. Are the profits reinvested? We can see that corporate investment is not all that great. So we have to make a choice. Do we give $1 billion to help corporations by reducing their taxes so that they'll create 3,000 jobs, or do we take this billion and create 16,000, 17,000 jobs, or either with respect to infrastructure or whatever? It's clear that this $1 billion would be better spent in targeted policies that deal with job creation. That's the first element. Secondly, is it now the time to set up a new economic plan? In our opinion, we do have a mechanism which helps us adjust when a recession takes place. This is UI. Today, we should be looking at employment insurance to ensure that it applies when the recession hits. There are 39% of the employees are eligible for EUI today. Thank you.
What do you think, Mr. Hodgson? Do you think we should impede companies from making a profit?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, we're on the record as saying that we thought the business tax adjustments undertaken over the last 3 years were really important to help companies adapt to the fact that we're now trading with a very strong, and we become the Switzerland of North America when it comes to the exchange rate. And our view is the Canadian dollar is going to stay a strong currency for a long time to come, driven by the commodity prices that Mr. Bryson talked about. So we think the sales tax harmonization, elimination of capital taxes, and reductions in corporate income tax were a critical piece of helping Canadian companies adjust. Now, revenues have to be made up someplace. And we're also on the record as saying that Canada should have a carbon tax, should have a national carbon tax to support what provinces are already doing with carbon taxation. But I'm a big advocate of thinking about tax reform. I'd love to come back and talk with you further about this.
But you would agree, I was always under the impression that we generate most of our revenue from the government from profitable companies, so it's kind of important that our companies remain profitable, and it's a good thing if they're profitable.
Yeah, I think Canadian companies really need an overall environment to be as competitive as possible right now, and the dollar adjustment was probably the biggest shock that they've experienced over the last, say, 5 years, having to adapt to a strong dollar. And for many companies, they really have had to fundamentally rethink their business operations if they're going to stay in business in Canada.
What about trade? I want to just switch over to trade for a second. We're a trading nation. This is the first time we've ever dealt with something at a global situation where we're all in this together. So how important is trade? We've instituted a number of trade deals with a number of countries. We're on the right track. We want to keep moving in that direction. We need to make more of these.
In one word, yes. I think more free trade is good. It gives us access to other markets. It increases competition at home, which is also good for our economy because it forces companies to sharpen their pencils on an ongoing basis. And it really is allowing Canadian companies to take advantage of what are called global supply chains or global value chains as they change their business model. So we're, again, on the record, strongly supporting bilateral, regional, or multilateral free trade, however you can accomplish it. I think Canada benefits from access to more markets around the world. One of the good things that happened after the financial crisis is we saw very few trade barriers put in place because under globalization, firms and national economies are more and more integrated. And so people understand that doing a Buy American clause, for example, just shoots yourself in the foot. You've actually hurt your own economy by putting a barrier in the way. So I could only encourage the government to pursue more free trade. In Asia, I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's going to require us to address some barriers at home that are actually preventing us from having full access to free trade.
Now, I don't want to keep picking on you, but you did say...
Oh, I don't mind.
You did say that we need to be flexible. And being flexible, though, would you think that it would be prudent for us to spend more money aside from being flexible? For instance, needed infrastructure projects. Is it a good policy of the government to get further into debt, to just spend more money, just to spend our way out of this thing?
No, I think it's very important to have an anchor, a medium-term anchor, in terms of rebalancing the books, not just getting the debt-GDP ratio under control. You know, you can actually run a deficit and have a falling debt-GDP ratio. I don't think that's good enough. I think it's hard to explain to people, for example. So having an anchor point is really important. whether it's 2014, 2015, or a year or two later, by virtue of the fact that global growth has slowed down, that has hit us in terms of non-income growth. That's where I would suggest maybe rethinking the track to get there. But I don't think the economy needs more fiscal stimulus right now, but I wouldn't close my mind to it either in the event that circumstances turn out much worse in Europe and in the U.S. than we're foreseeing right now.
Would you agree, Mr. Leitao?
Generally speaking, yes. But I would add that there are ways of building bridges without necessarily adding to the national debt. You can also think in terms of how do you finance the building of that bridge. There are all kinds of partnerships that can be put in place, and God forgive that you have to put a toll booth. Oh my God! Those things should also be considered.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Van Kesteren. We'll go to Mr. Marston, please. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. Sorry again for the delay of getting here. We had the vote to take care of. Mr. Hodgson, you were talking about trade people movement throughout the country. Are you familiar with the Red Seal? Red Seal is where you keep a certain standard level of training for all of the trades. The last thing we need is some kind of dumbing down of the quality tradespeople we have. And it's more of a comment than a question. My real question for you, the Conference Board recently published a report detailing rising inequality in Canada, a very good report. And I'd like you to comment on the ways that this inequality is not only bad in social justice terms, but how it's bad for the economy. You know, it affects consumption, how the effect of demand. If you'd like to expand on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, it sounds somewhat like a rhetorical question, but thank you for acknowledging that work. We do a report card on Canada's performance called How Canada Performs, entirely on our website, and we did look at inequality in the major OECD countries over the last 20 years. And as part of globalization, sadly, inequality is growing in most countries around the world. And in Canada, the rate of growth of inequality as we measured it was actually greater than in the United States, which is a bit of a surprising result. We didn't do detailed analysis on the economic impacts of that, but I think we're starting to highlight them. Things like if people with lower incomes aren't keeping pace with income growth across the economy, that takes away from potential demand in your economy. Often they're buying locally made goods. They're not importing BMWs. Nothing wrong with BMWs. But we were asking questions about whether we're doing enough as a country to ensure that all Canadians are benefiting from economic growth, whether it's the lack of job security, people retiring with insufficient incomes. Ongoing poverty is kind of a festering sore within an economy, and I think it does drag down your ongoing growth potential. And it's something we're going to come back to in future further research, because we didn't really go deeply into the causes, but I'd like to do that in our future research.
I think it's important that you're keeping an eye on it. I appreciate that. Mr. Porter, right now we are hearing that there's $500 billion of business money just sitting there. It's not being invested. We have a situation where the private sector has withdrawn. And from our standpoint, having public investment is critically important. And I understand you were quoted just yesterday in the Globe and Mail, and you said Mr. Harper's global austerity suggestions of that is the wrong medicine at this time. Would you like to expand on that a bit? Because to my mind, I would tend to agree with you that it's time for this government to invest. It's not time for the government to withdraw if the business community has already withdrawn.
My comments were aimed more at the global economy generally, and specifically at the U.S. and as per my earlier comments. You know, my concern now is that the U.S. doesn't focus too much on controlling their budget deficit, given the fact that their economy is gasping for air, and they've had very little employment growth in the past year or so. In terms of the buildup of cash levels at the corporations, I guess the one thing I would say is that's a bit of an unfortunate but understandable byproduct of the financial crisis that we went through in 2008, 2009, when cash was absolutely king. And for all intents and purposes, the financial markets had a virtual heart attack in the fall of 2008. And in order to guard against, you know, that kind of extreme hunt for cash, we've seen, you know, not just in Canada, this is really happening around the world, where corporations just believe they have to build up these higher defense walls, and they believe they have to essentially keep more ready cash on hand. And that's as I said, on the unfortunate byproduct, or one of the byproducts of the financial crisis. In terms of business investment, I would point out that actually that's been one of the stronger areas of the economy in the last year. We actually have seen quite a pickup in capital spending in the last year.
Okay, I understand. I just have 1 minute. Less than 1 minute. Well, Mr. Chatang, I understand that the CLC is promoting a policy of an investment in seniors, and we have done the same thing in the House for over 2 years, talking about raising the guaranteed income supplement. I mean, we have seniors living in poverty in this country. We had a modest increase of $50 a month. We're saying that increase should be closer to $200 a month. I'd like your comments on that, please.
Yes, quickly, we have to think about short-term but also long-term, and building up capacity in order to retire in decent living conditions and maintain your purchasing power is something that we are concerned, and we should take a look at it right now. Because in order to build up that saving, you have to take a look at it right now. And what we're proposing are two things. The first thing is, of course, increasing GIS to take care of those seniors living in poverty today. And what has been done is not enough. It's not going to raise or remove everybody out of poverty, all the seniors out of poverty, and more should be done. The second thing is we have to think about those workers today that are in debt and are not saving enough for their retirements. And in order to do that, we're proposing to double CPP.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Marston. We'll go to Ms. McLeod, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also I'd like to thank the panels. And if I think I was going to summarize in broad terms, what I'm hearing is a softening from original projections, but not quite, certainly not below negative. And I'm hearing that, you know, we need to be very watchful. I've heard in general a suggestion that we be pragmatic and flexible. So we have, as a government, I think I also heard that debt in the long term is a big problem, and we do need to get back to balanced budget. I think that was certainly an important piece. When you look at where the government is going in terms of its reduction in government spending, and I actually looked at the numbers, and I think we were looking at 0.2% of GDP, or 0.02. So really we were looking at $4 billion and looking at government and how are they spending. So I guess I'd certainly say to Mr. Hodgson first and maybe Mr. Porter, you know, 5% of perhaps what might be inefficient spending in different areas of government expenditures, is that, you know, it seems quite feasible and doable to me with very modest impact. So government should be looking towards not spending money on programs that aren't efficient anymore. Comments?
Structure of spending, but I'm going to start with your first point. The track for nominal income growth, because that's what government taxes actually, is below what we were forecasting 18 months ago. I came out with my colleague Matthew Stewart, who's here, and we talked about the government's capacity to actually balance the books by 2015, which was the conversation at that point. We said it was quite doable. We are below that growth track now. Not by a huge amount, but by a few billions. And that means that in our forecast, the government will be able to balance its books in 2015-16 now. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing going out one year longer. It's not going to add much to Canada's overall stock of debt. We have to be mindful of the ratio as well. But but I would not counsel withdrawal of stimulus. So don't just stick to the plan because you had a plan. Think about the plan in the real-world context where we're having these extraordinary shocks from outside, and then do a course correction with the end plan still being in sight.
Which is what I believe we've heard the Prime Minister and our Minister state, that, you know, we have a plan right now, but we do have to watch. We need to be flexible, pragmatic. But I think it's perhaps always good practice for government to review how they spend taxpayers' dollars and make sure they're efficient and effective. Mr. Porter, have you got any?
In terms of the broad fiscal plan, I thought it was quite reasonable as of and up to the second budget in early June. As I indicated in my opening comments, I do think the global economic landscape has shifted and can potentially shift a great deal more in the last 4 months or so. But you know, I wouldn't. Again, I think it's too early to to significantly change tack at this point. You know, I may not agree with all the micro moves beneath the surface, but I think in terms of the broader plan, it was quite reasonable.
Okay. Good. We also talked in terms of tax reductions and how they can be very important in terms of businesses. What we did hear is that there's some businesses with money sitting on the sidelines. In addition to, or perhaps besides the issue of taxes, what would you say are some things that government can do to encourage the businesses to be putting their money on the table? Looks like Mr. Leteo wanted to.
Well, there are always, as has been mentioned several times before, free trade, extending free trade with other countries to gain access to other markets. One of the things that we unfortunately realize now is that we are still highly dependent on the United States. Still 75% of our exports go to the U.S. So looking to other markets and on that basis, pursuing free trade is a good option. And also internal barriers to the circulation of goods and workers. Canada is a federation, and this federation is not exactly ideal. In a way, it allows goods and services to flow within. So we should also try to look at those barriers to make things flow a little bit better.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
Very briefly, also, we could focus on the manufacturing sector and provide income tax credits to companies investing in new machinery and equipment and research and development, as well as workers training. There's a sector that is at need and has been deeply affected in the last 10 years and needs help.
Okay, thank you. Monsieur Giguère, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Thank you for presenting your viewpoints to the Finance Committee. Stats Canada said that Canadian businesses had kept $500 billion in their reserves. And a review of the financial system presented by the Bank of Canada said that if this money is not, that says that this money is not invested. There's been a slight increase in investments, but it's largely inadequate. And at the same time, you have all this money in reserve, but over the past few years, 300,000 jobs have been lost in Canada in the manufacturing sector. Our productivity is declining. Our research and development is declining. Well-paid jobs are being replaced by jobs that are not so well paid, which explains that despite the fact that 600,000 jobs have been created, the earning power of Canadians has deteriorated. So this has become critical. Stats Canada says that the level of household debt is about 50%. And we're talking about the average Canadian here. There are regional inequalities as well. In BC, 80% of the salaries are used just to pay for their rent. So I would ask you, essentially, why is it that Canada is still investing into these reserves, or why the corporations are keeping this money in reserves? How can we have, and this is leading to a lower income for all Canadians. So anybody is free to answer. Your question has got several aspects to it. As for the fact that the corporations are keeping money in reserves, I think this is temporary. As my colleague said, this is a situation that has evolved because of the tremendous amount of uncertainty in Europe, where the European banks are now going through what we saw in the United States 3 years ago. But I think that's temporary. I think that once that we've gone past this step, that the European crisis is not so serious, you will see once again corporations prepared to invest. Now, as far as the manufacturing sector is concerned, how can we restore our sector? That's a very complicated issue. This is a global phenomenon. It's been going on for many years. In Canada, for the past number of years, we have been isolated from that because our money was low for so long. So that was obscured by this issue. But we have seen this changing very quickly over the past few years. The government could take measures to support the manufacturing sector, of course, but we have to consider the fact that we're part of the world community. Some things can be done, but some things the government just can't do. That's an important issue that deserves a discussion. I would like to say in answer to your question that the situation is not really all that temporary. For the past 10 years, Canadian corporations have been making more profits than they have been investing. And so normally it should be the households that are lending to the corporations. As for the manufacturing sector, it's about free trade, which was alluded to earlier. I would say that free trade is a good thing when you have full employment, but when you don't have full employment, free trade is not necessarily positive, and in fact has led to the inequalities that were alluded to earlier. So if you would like a suggestion to improve the productivity in Canada, and I would like to thank the government member for asking this question, if we were to increase real salaries, if we were to increase minimum salaries, that would force companies to be more productive so that they could keep their profits. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Giguère.
Bienvenue à tous nos témoins aujourd'hui.
To thank the witnesses for coming today.
I'm in my 5 minutes. So I listened closely. I just want to ask you, Mr. Leteo, would you agree that the current economic turbulence here in Canada, that Canada is facing, is because of shocks beyond our borders? So is it fair to say that this was not a made-in-Canada problem?
With that, yes.
You would agree with that? Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. You agree, Mr. Chatang?
There are issues such as the trade imbalance between countries and the way we've been trading that have impacted us, and that's the way we interact with other countries, so it's not entirely out of our borders.
Monsieur Porter?
I would agree with you.
And Monsieur Lamar?
I also agree.
Agree. Thank you. Next question, another quick question. To be clear, some in the opposition have suggested strongly that Canada's economy will shrink this year and next. Is anyone here projecting negative growth this year or next? Monsieur Leteo?
This year, no. I mean, anything is possible, but I don't think so. Next year, 2012, there's a risk if the global economy does slide, particularly the United States, which for us is much more important than Europe in terms of direct links. So if the U.S. does slide into recession in 2012, then Canada would follow, yes.
And if it doesn't?
If the U.S. doesn't slide, then we will stay with economic growth in the 1.5% to 2% range.
Very good. Mr. Hodgson?
We're forecasting growth of just over 2% this year and about 2.5% next year, but within a very wide band because of the extraordinary risk that we're facing in the global economy.
Very good. Mr. Porter?
We're forecasting growth of just a little bit above 2% this year and a little bit below 2% next year. We're attaching risks of a recession at about 35% over the next year, which is higher than normal, no doubt about it.
And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go to the third question. I'm not understanding how inefficient programs, which is what we're actually looking at in part of our review, and I've heard, some talk about, the need for government to maybe be flexible and cutting spending. Is there a good way to cut spending or is there a bad way to cut spending? I don't understand how inefficient programs that don't stimulate the economy, why would we keep those programs and not use that money for something else? So the question tied to that is, how do inefficient programs support the economy? Mr. Leteo.
Well, by definition, if a program is inefficient, it's not going to support anything. I would just add, though, that is kind of micromanaging of government spending. I don't have the expertise to do that, luckily. But I would just add one thing. When we talk about being flexible, what we mean is that the government should be prepared to accept a larger deficit if indeed we go into recession. And I think something was mentioned here, I think it's very important. If indeed we go into recession, government spending will automatically increase. And at that time, I don't think it will be at all appropriate for the government to not loosen up employment insurance program, because that will be a very important program if the economy does slide into recession. So the deficit would go up, yes, and it shouldn't be fought. It should be allowed to go up.
Right. But getting back to the issue of programs, we believe there are programs that are not giving value for taxpayer dollar. I think it would be irresponsible, and I'm asking your opinion if you agree with this, I think it would be irresponsible for a government not to review those programs and cut them if, in fact, they are not providing value for dollar, particularly in this tough economic time. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, as a taxpayer, sure. I think that should be a permanent feature of government. You should always be reviewing programs. And if something doesn't make sense now, then that should be put. That should be stopped. 1 minute. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. Can you comment on the same issue?
As a first principle, I agree with Carlos, but I would add to the agenda tax expenditures, because that's a net loss of $100 billion of revenue for government, and value for money applies on the tax expenditure side as much as on the spending side. But as a first principle, a well-managed government should be regularly reviewing all of its spending to optimize value for money.
Thank you. And cutting where it's inefficient.
Cutting where it's inefficient, but also be mindful of the macroeconomic impact of the cuts. So when you do it, as important as what you do.
All right, Mr. Porter.
Unequivocally, I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Levant.
Well, I would say the first inefficient program that should be cut is the reduction in the corporate income taxes.
Very good.
Briefly, would reiterate that finding efficiencies in the government is part of managing the government well, but finding efficiencies in order to balance the book as quickly as possible and then expanding TFSA and income splitting as an outcome in 2 or 3 years down the road is not necessarily the best and economic sound decision.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur Glover. Madame Glover, excuse. Mr. Jean, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And of course, when you increase taxes and mandate high wages, you lose corporations to other countries that are more competitive. And I think you would all agree with me, Mr. Lavoie. But notwithstanding that, I noticed that Mr. Hodgson, I think it was, identified that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities identified somewhere of a $123 billion infrastructure deficit in 2006. And of course, our government's response to that and this economic crisis was to invest somewhere in the neighborhood of, including all of the programs, $47 billion, plus, of course, municipal and provincial money. So somewhere in the neighborhood, they were trying to leverage about $120 to $150 billion. And in fact, I do want to remind the witnesses today that that program hasn't even ended yet as far as the outpouring of money. In fact, I would say not all of it has actually been spent. In fact, very little of it, because the bills haven't come in. And I think the program actually continues on until the end of next month. So it's fair to say, I think, that the economy, all economies are a pendulum, and if you hit the pendulum or allow it to slide too far one way or the other, you could run into problems. Isn't that fair to say, such as overinflation, such as not stimulating the economy enough and having a downpouring of jobs, less jobs? Is that fair to say?
The word pendulum, we would talk about a business cycle, and economies going through cycles.
I understand, but it's fair to say that if you stimulate the economy one way or understimulate it in another, you could lead to more problems in the future.
If you're talking about poor economic management, absolutely. I mean, that's an example of why Greece has ended up in the mess that they're in right now, because they really had poorly designed macro policies over a long period of time, and it caught up with them.
Absolutely. So, in fact, not just to remain flexible, but to remain sensitive of what's going on in the world is the most important thing we can do as a government. That's correct?
Being mindful of all the circumstances, absolutely. That was the opening comment of many of us.
Now, one of the things that Mr. Chateng suggested was to encourage private companies to invest more, and I had that as a first question, and to stockpile less cash. Are there other things that we could do that the witnesses would have ideas, for instance, tax incentive for accelerated depreciation, which obviously worked in the oil sands and other areas across the country? Any other suggestions, Mr. Chateng, in relation to that?
Yes, there's different ways in order to make our country more productive. Of course, providing help for manufacturing sector, for instance, as I said earlier, investment credits, for instance, as I said, research and development, not only within corporations, but across the country through the university sector, for instance, as well as workers' training. There are some issues about workers' training and the renewal of the workforce, although we did capture the issue about the Red Seal and mobility between provinces, which I don't think is an issue. But we can go beyond this, is that corporations benefits from the kind of infrastructure they have around them. So a bridge that is falling apart is not good, or not having enough workers that have the skills and the education that are needed in order to provide the productive work is also needed. But there's other things we can do, for instance, in social infrastructure. If we are, we're facing an aging workforce and we'd like to see more Canadians working, we'd like to see more women and more Aboriginal workings. There are programs such as childcare that we can put in place to allow more women to go back to work and improve labor force participations and make sure that companies have workers when they need them. So it's beyond helping corporations. There are things that we can do in terms of public infrastructure that help us become more productive.
But to be fair, my question was really relating to getting rid of the cash that's in the bank accounts right now. And those are the things how we can incent corporations to do that, because the money's already there, and obviously it's a low-hanging fruit that we could identify in the near future. So that was my question. And Mr. Lavoie, my final question is you wrote a book called Money, Income, Production, and Wealth in 2007. It's a book that deals with stock flow consistent method. Can you make money after reading that book? I'm just sort of curious, because my stocks are going crazy right now, and I can't keep track.
Got about 45 seconds.
The book was it was not about the stock market. It was rather about the distinction between flows, income, and stocks, meaning debt, capital, and so on. But to answer the question that you put just before, I would say that, trying to get firms to invest for the future, firms need to believe that there will be aggregate demand, that there is a demand for their products. So if that demand is not forthcoming from consumers anymore, then as I said in my presentation at the beginning, it's got to come from the government, because it's not going to come from our exports to Europe or to the United States next year.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know at least two witnesses have to leave sharply at 1 o'clock. I just wanted to clarify, because we've had having this debate about austerity and about we were in a period of stimulus, now we're in a period of austerity. So I actually pulled up the budget we passed in June, and we have a temporary hiring credit, we have extension of the work sharing program, we have extension of the accelerated capital cost allowance for the manufacturing sector, extension of the best 14 weeks in working for EI, we have enhancing the guaranteed income supplement, we have more money for healthcare workers in the rural areas, we have more money for industrial research assistance program, more money for Canada Excellence Research Chairs, more money for the federal granting councils. We have 6% increases for healthcare, transfers to the provinces, 3% for education, social assistance for the provinces. I mean, I know two of you are recommending more stimulus, and I know, Glenn, you're recommending that we sort of stay along the path, but to the other two of you, I mean, is this austerity? Is this austerity? 6%, 3% increases, more money for R&D, more money for the manufacturing sector?
I guess the light is I have to answer. As I said before, when we're talking about government austerity, Mr. Bryson said I would make a good politician. This is not Greek-style austerity by any means. But it's also the timing is also important. And if indeed the global economy is going to, or there's a risk it may slide into a recession in 2012, then at that time we will be well advised to do more of that, to spend even more.
Okay. Mr. Porter?
From our perspective, this year was not a particularly austere year. I mean, to us, 2011, this year's budget was really more of a transition from stimulus to restraint. So, no, I wouldn't say that this year was particularly austere at all. Next year, we were expecting some modest restraint. I'm not sure that I would necessarily call it austerity.
Well, can I then just put the two of you on the spot, because I know where the other three stand? With respect to the $4 billion out of the $80 billion of strategic review on fiscal policy, would you advise the Government of Canada to continue with its strategic review of that $80 billion to find $4 billion in savings over the next 4 years? Yes or no?
I don't have a problem with $4 billion in savings. I guess what I would suggest that is if the global economy truly stumbles, we might want to reallocate that into something else down the line. But I certainly don't have a problem with finding savings where they can be found at this point.
Okay. And Mr. Lettero?
Neither do I. No problem. But again, be prepared to spend more in 2012 if need be.
If need be. Okay. I want to thank all of you. I apologize again for the late start of the session. It was a very informative session. I want to thank colleagues, thank our witnesses for being here, and we will see you on Thursday. Meeting adjourned.